have a grill.
Just remember to record.
We do, brats and hot dogs and, hamburgers and some, meatless things as well. And then we ask people to bring a dish to share. So put that date on your calendar and you'll be hearing more about it. We do have a couple other things happening that we want people to know about. One is gonna be here on May 23rd. The city's gonna be having their, public hearing and information session on the changes proposed for the Hartley Pond and Hartley Dam that's been in the news the last year. There've been a couple of input sessions about that. They've now got a proposal that will be recommended to the city council. I saw the presentation last week at a Parks and Rec Commission meeting, so it's a really interesting, informative presentation. And if you want to know more about that or want to weigh in on what's happening, that meeting is 6 o'clock on May 23rd, here. Is there other events anyone wants to announce that are coming up? I know May's a busy time and there's a lot of things that happen. No, all right. Well, then I think without further ado, I will put in one plug for those of you here in the room that are Ike's members or thinking of becoming members. We'd love to have you. We really are looking for some new board members or people who want to participate in the Conservation Issues Committee. So these are the people that are really the legs that make the chapter work. If you think maybe the board isn't for you, but you're interested in issues that we work on and you'd like to get involved, learn more, maybe help write comments like we just had a group write comments on the management plan, update scoping process for the Boundary Waters canoe area. If you're interested in those kind of activities, we would really like to have your involvement. It takes a lot of good thoughts and good work to make some of these things move forward. So please join us in that work. And you can talk to Craig or myself or Rich. Why don't I just have board members raise your hand in the room? Any of the board members here would be happy to talk to you tonight or at the picnic or over email. And that said, I want to introduce our speaker for tonight. Actually, I'm going to introduce Jan Keogh, our board member, who's going to introduce our speaker for tonight. And this is a talk we've been looking forward to all year. So we are recording the meeting. If you're participating online, I hope you're muted, or Molly will see that you get muted. But if you have questions, you can type those into the chat and we'll make sure that they get addressed. So,
thanks, Julie. So tonight's speaker really needs no introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway. I am really honored to introduce Dr. John Pastor. John's a professor of Emeritus in the Department of Biology at UMD. He's been in Duluth since the early 80s, and he's been an active member of our community and contributed his knowledge and skills in too many ways to list here, but I'm going to make an attempt. John and his students have studied and published on the structure and function of the, quote, North Woods, the boreal forest from Minnesota through Canada into the maritime provinces in Scandinavia. His focus has been on plant and animal species and communities and their ecosystem relationships and trends, with a particular strength in mathematical modeling. I'm most familiar with the work that John and Nate Johnson and their students have done on the responses of wild rice to sulfur geochemistry and other environmental conditions, including mercury geochemistry. And this work has been fundamental to current efforts to understand where wild rice thrives and to protect it. But John's research has been much, much wider in scope and topic, including effects of moose browse on vegetation systems, spatial patterns in boreal landscapes, nutrient cycling, and effects of climate change in peatlands, and much more. What's really impressive to me about Dr. Pastor is that he doesn't confine his research results to the geek science community alone. I include myself there. He extends his knowledge into the public facing information. He published a wonderful article about John Moyle, quote, Minnesota's Aldo Leopold in Agate magazine. He published a book. Thank you, Stephanie. And he published a book for kids, What Should a Clever Moose Eat?
No, that's not for kids.
Not for kids,
No.
for everyone. For everyone. And of course, his most recent book on white pine, The Natural and Human History of a Foundational Tree. John is an honorary member of the Finnish Society of Forest Science, and he's received many, numerous honors in Minnesota and elsewhere. He's an accomplished artist and a blacksmith, right?
Well, kind of, I'm learning a lot about that.
So I'm truly delighted to introduce John Pastor tonight to tell us about white pine. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Janet, for that very nice introduction. I'm getting over a cold that I had. Apparently with this kind of cold, for whatever reason, it takes a long time to get your voice. And I think my voice is pretty much back. But if there's any time you can't hear me, just shout out, speak louder. And for people on Zoom, if you can't hear, just send something in the chat and someone will indicate to me that I need to speak louder. So let me explain about the clever moose. Why I said that. Everybody thinks it's a children's book, and my publisher for that, Island Press, who's published for this more recent book on white pine, at first didn't like the title because they thought everybody's going to think it's a book for children, and it's not. It's a collection of essays about the natural history of the Northwoods. And the reason for the title is one of my research projects, as Jan said, was what decisions a moose makes as it walks through a forest and deciding what to eat and where to eat and when to eat. And the reason why that's an important problem is because moose eat things like aspen and birch and don't eat things like spruce. And over a period of time, a moose herd or population can actually convert forests strongly to spruce, and spruce cycles nutrients and carbon at a very different rate than aspen or birch. So the decisions a moose makes has big implications for the whole ecosystem. We don't think of a moose as affecting it, but it really does. So that was the reason for the book. That's one of the essays in the book is what decision should the animal eat? So when I was writing that book, I was thinking, well, I should include an essay in there about white pine. But as I thought more and more about white pine, I realized that one essay wasn't going to do much. That what it really needed was a whole book, minutes. And the reason for that is, from the subtitle of this book, is it's a foundational tree species. And this is a term used in ecology. You've all heard of keystone species, which are predators at the top of the food chain, like wolves, that if you remove that predator, lots of things happen in the food. So that predator exerts control from the top down. So more recently, ecologists have been talking about the equivalent from the bottom up. So plant species that are fairly common, but exert inordinate amount of control over the cycle and nutrients and food web and habitat and so forth. And with the loss of that particular plant species, the entire ecosystem change. And examples of that outside of the Northwoods would be things like Douglas fir in the Pacific Northwest, sorrel cactus in desert, Southwest desert, big blue stem, in the tall grass prairie. And where the term was first used was for kelp in kelp forests off the coast of California. There's a keystone species. So I was thinking that this would be a nice way to think about white pine and its role in the Northwest. And as I got to think about it more and more, I realized that it's also a foundational species of a lot of the cultures that inhabit the Northwoods that I'll talk about tonight too. Cultures like the Native American cultures, the logging culture from the Albanian era to today. You'll see that it was instrumental in Thoreau developing this ideas of wilderness. Its laws was instrumental in developing ideas of watershed protection and conservation in American forestry and the role of fire in ecosystems. So white pine is both a ecological foundation of the Northwoods. It's also a foundation of the cultures that inhabit the Northwoods. And part of the reason why we have nice Walton and organizations like this. So give you, so why isn't it spoken?
Okay, should just. Before we did it, let's see.
Oh,
Yeah, just say we got it.
okay.
And then go through.
There.
Yeah.
So this is a photograph taken by Derek Montgomery, who did a story with Dan Clark in this book, and also partly on anybody knows John Ryler, the Ryler family, shouldn't name John. So I'll talk about John's work with white pine towards the end of this talk. But Dan called me up and said, well, I want to do a story on your book and John, or on your book. And he said, well, why don't we do it with John together? And we went out to John's family's property, the Wolf Lake Trail, and this is there. And I'll talk more about what John's doing there next. But I think Derek brought out a drone. And actually, if you go to NPR News, there's, and look up this story, there's a link to a video we did with the drone, where he started the drone here and slowly went up through the clouds, these two big white points. It's a fantastic video. And we don't have time to play it here to hurt you. But I think this particular photograph really shows this beautiful day, obviously in October, peak color, and everything. This is the Northwest. This is the Northwest. This combination of conifers and deciduous trees, including maple, but birch and everything else. But you can see the white pines, as I'm sure you've noticed in mountain woods, they tower above it. And their crowns are very deep. And so these trees are capturing a lot of the sun's energy, using it to fix carbon and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere into their biomass, and then store their large biomass and not bring it back into the atmosphere as much. Then that balances the cell plants grow, so they get carbon and store it. But these needles eventually drop to the forest floor, and you can see the very large crowns and plenty of white pine through the landscape here. Their needles determine the cycling of nitrogen and other nutrients through the soil. The large crowns act as habitat for eagles, bears, squirrels, lots of different animals. So this is really, in this picture, I think this photograph of Derek's really captures in a visual way why white pine is a foundation species. And this is something, this idea of foundation species is being researched a lot these days. So I'm sure we'll find out lots more about it in decades than what's in this book. And someone else will rewrite this book or do another book in 20 years. maybe explaining why I'm wrong. Which would be you. So when I was writing this book, I was thinking, well, I'll just go back to the, how white man got the replacements, right? But then I thought, well, maybe I just for myself, I'll research the evolution of white man. And then I got into the evolution of all plants, and this really interesting. And it turns out this is really important how we have interacted through the centuries. So the first pine, the oldest fossil pine, was found in some rocks in Nova Scotia. Well, back 140 million years ago. And what was happening at the time was the Atlantic Ocean was opening up like a signal from south to north. So Africa and South America were together at the base, and they started opening up maybe 50, 60 million years before that, maybe even longer, like a zipper. And then when it got to the tip, where North America and northern tip and Eurasia were still connected together, and Nova Scotia's right there in the middle. That's when the first pine originated, this Pinus mondega. And the fossil is a fossil of the twig. And here are the places where the needles were connected to the twig. Much, not unlike jack, if you've really looked at a jackpine twig, this reminds me. The other interesting thing about this is there are traces of charcoal on this fossil, indicating that pines from the start were associated with fires in some way. So pines are not found in the southern hemisphere unless we plant them, like Pinus radiata in New Zealand. They are circumpolar in the hemisphere. And the reason is that when the pines evolved, Eurasia and North America were still attached to each other, and they spread out east and west from there. But the southern hemisphere continents, Africa and South America, were separate from each other and separate from Europe and Eurasia. So pines are circumpolar northern species, not on the southern hemisphere. About 20 million years later, the pines split, evolved into two what are called subgenera, the yellow pines and the white pines, of which our eastern white pine is sort of the species of the white pines. And this is a very important split for, as you'll see throughout the rest of this talk. Yellow pines, jack pine and red pine are yellow pines, loblolly pine is yellow, Scots pine in Europe is yellow. Yellow pines have a lot more resin to them. They're more brittle, they're more flexible. Yellow pines is where you get turpentine, pine tar out of them, and so forth. The wood is harder, much harder than the white pines. The white pines have much less of it. The wood is not yellowish like red pine is or loblolly pine. It's creamy white. I'm sure you're all familiar with. And that's the large white. About 60 million years ago, all of a sudden the pines start to radiate into huge diversity of pines. The main about 120 species of pines worldwide. Most of the species is here in North America. And the reason why all of this evolution here is branching of the evolutionary tree is because of the rise of the Rocky Mountains, which is pretty much ending at this time. So what was happening is during warm periods in the climate, the pines, these species down here, would be driven up into higher elevations in different valleys in the Rocky Mountains, and they were separated. So mutations that happened in different valleys stayed in those valleys. The pollen didn't go over the valleys, they didn't cause pollen. When the climate cooled, pines spread out in those valleys onto the plains and came together again. But over a period of time, this happened, they went back and forth. When I came down out of the valleys, many of them can no longer interbreed. They became essentially separate species. So the evolution of plants here is tied to the rise of Rocky Mountains and a lot of changes in climate that have been happening in the last 60 million years that have separated populations. They evolved differently and came back together. They couldn't interbreed. They became separate species. So climate change and fire have been part of evolution ecology of climate. Away from, and that's going to have implications later on. So what do we do about Pinus of climate change now? So Pinus strobus, which is our white pine, is down here. It's actually one of the later pines in the pine genus. And jack pine and red pine are up here on yellow.
Okay, they want you to kind of talk toward this microphone.
Okay.
People online, so you have to stand over here.
Stand over here. So this went on back and forth in the Rocky Mountains, way over here. Pines are doing this. And eventually, about 18,000 years ago, the big ice sheet came down through Massachusetts, came down through here, and the white pine was pushed into a refuge in North Carolina and Virginia, and probably out into the Atlantic Ocean, though we don't know where it went out there because it's all covered with ocean sediment. We know this from the pollen. If you take a core through lakes, and the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities, particularly Margaret Davis, who I work with, was one of the key university research groups to develop pollinology, the use of pollen in lakes to figure out vegetational history of an area. So we go out into any lake and take a core. We could date the different layers of sediment in the core through carbon-14 and so forth. And you could extract the pollen from that core and under a microscope determine what species were in the landscape around that shedding pollen. And the white pine now is starting to shed pollen. It's starting to see some yellow dust on your car in the morning. That's white pine. It's a prolific producer. This is what the pollen grains look for white pine. This is the actual pollen itself. And here are two air-filled sacs that allow the pollen grain to be buoyant and spread on the winds. So Margaret Davis had this great idea of going and compiling data from lakes all over Eastern North America and looking to see when is the first time of arrival of pollen in the lake core. And from that, she could trace not just for white pine, but hemlock and sugar maple and all the different oaks, how they spread out from their refuges after the glaciers left. And from that data, you could draw lines and say, well, this is the leading edge of white pine about 14,000 years ago, when it was in its refuge. The glacier started receding about 16,000 years ago, but 14,000 years or 12,000 years ago. White pine had spread to here, and then over here, by 2,000 years, it was up into Massachusetts and so forth. Then it sort of spread by several branches. One branch went up into New England and the Maritimes, and then north of the Great Lakes, spread westward, and another branch spread south of the Great Lakes, and they coalesced here in Minnesota, getting to Duluth about, in this region, only about 6,000 years. And finally reaching the westernmost limit out by the midget, the big Paul Bunyan statue in the pines out there. That's only 2,000 years of white pine, which might seem like a long time, except that white pine lives about 400 years. And so that's only, what, 5 lifetimes of white pine that have been out there. It's in geologic time, that's relatively recent. So that's the movement of white pine and how it got to the current range, which is largely centered on the Great Lakes. Well, the first people to actually Greek white pine as it arrived were the ancestors of the Native Americans, particularly the two great confederations of tribes, the Iroquois and the Anishinaabe. And the Iroquois included, let's see, I have it here in my notes. The Cayugas, Senecas, Mohawks, Oneidas, and Onondagas. They were 5 tribes. And white pine, you know, has 5 needles joined together at the bundle and fascicle. And these 5 tribes of the Iroquois Confederation, what would become the Iroquois Confederation, were constantly fighting each other. This was before European settlers. And a leader of one of the tribes called all the tribes together. His name was Daganavida. And Hiawatha was actually a sort of a student of his, pupil of his. And Daganavida said, well, we can't be fighting each other. This isn't getting us anywhere. And he called all the tribes together under a large white pine, thought to be somewhere around the Finger Lakes region of New York. And he held up a plaque and he said, notice these 5 needles. That's each of our 5 tribes. But look, they're joined together. They're one. So this is what we have to be. And this big white pine here supports eagles and so forth. Actually, the legend is that the Daganavida called an eagle to land on top of the white pine to oversee all this and then spread the word among all the tribes. The Anishinaabe, the other group, includes not just the Ojibwe here, but Potawatomi, Menominee, Fox, Algonquin tribes on these, the Abenaki in Maine and so forth. And again, they also revered white pine, but they also had, the reason why they revered white pine is because they had a similar notion to this idea of ecological foundation, foundation of the ecosystem. They saw white pine as providing so much to the rest of the community, food for squirrels and habitat for bears and eagles and so forth, that they said this is the king tree of the ecosystem, and they revered it. So white pine became important in their culture. The reason why we know that other people, the ancestors and we saw the white pines arrive here, was because in archaeological excavations, there are different cultures determined by the arrow point types and spear point types and associated with different geological events. And in those lakes, we could see what the vegetation. So when the early ancestors of the Native Americans first arrived here, it was a spruce parkland and a spruce forest. And it was only about, this is somewhere around Ontario, about 9,000 years ago, 8 to 9,000 years ago, that the vegetation became pine dominated. And we have a different culture here. So these were the people down here somewhere that saw white pine arrive in this area. Well, about 1,500, another group, bunch of tribes that had a very different idea of the use of trees in forests, and that was the ancestors of most of us, the white Europeans. And the colonists very quickly saw the use of white pines to for building houses and barns and bridges and everything else they needed, but also as a commodity that was very valuable to sell worldwide. And what it was most especially sold for and valuable was for ships' masts. And as the ships, sailing ships became larger and larger, the mast they needed had to be bigger and bigger to hold up all this sail and to be strong enough and flexible and in the wind. White pine was perfect. Very large, straight tree, clear of knots all the way up. It's a very old tree, and the flexibility of pine lumber allowed the tree to flex in the wind instead of being really stiff and snap. So the colonists thought, well, maybe the British Navy would. Do this. British Navy didn't want the white pines at first. They were getting their pines from the Baltic regions, which is largely Scots pine, one of the yellow pines over there, because it was closer to them, and they preferred that because they could also get tar out of those forests and other things called naval stores, turpentine and so forth. So they said to the colonists at first, no, we don't want any white pines. You go ahead and sell them. And so the colonists were selling them to France and Spain and so forth. Well, France and Spain were always in wars with England. So the colonists were actually selling white pines to England's enemies. Colonists were making money, things over there. And an awful lot of money was made off of one tree. Like one tree in today's dollars can fetch $20,000. One of these really big trees that they need for the mainmast of the ship. Well, one of the many wars that England was having with France and the Netherlands and Spain. I think it was the Netherlands blockaded the entrance to the Baltic, and the British could no longer gain access to the Scots pines in Estonia. In fact, a lot of those big Scots pines, they were running out because of the faster than built to that size. So the king said to the colonists, okay, now I want this. And actually, I'm not going to pay for it in mine because I'm the king. So any pine greater than 24 inches, it's mine. And I'm sending surveyors over to make a mark called the King's Broad Arrow there on the left. Yeah, left. And any tree with that mark is mine. And I will send people over. Or maybe I'll ask you. Well, this didn't sit well with the colonists. And eventually they revolted. And there was a white pine tree run in New Hampshire in 1772, where two of the surveyors were actually tarred with pine tar and sent out of town. This was the first, not the Boston Tea Party, but the first actual active violence against the British. And in fact, this was the model that later became the Tea Party, which is 3 years later. So it was the reaction not against the tea tax, but the white pine of the king saying, I own it, you don't. And in New England, which is where a lot of the revolution started and took place, the New England Revolutionary flag had a white pine, so 5 stars for 6 stars, 6 states in New England, 6 colonies, and a white pine there in the corner. And in the Battle of Bunker Hill, this painting by John Trumbull, you can see that flag up here. These are the colonists fighting the redcoats over here. And you can see the white pine flag up here, the flag in the room. The sun's shining on that, it's very stormy, and the British flag is here in the dark, and the sun is shining on that. The colonists, and even though we lost the Battle of Bunker Hill, this was a metaphor that we were going to go on and win the war, and we did. So white pine became part of a symbol in the colonists' culture of freedom and free to exploit the natural resources of the colonies. And we didn't owe the king anything; these were ours, and they weren't the king's. So this was part of the impetus for the Revolutionary War. Well, after that, of course, after we won, we started cutting pine, starting from Maine and moving west. And here on this slide, everybody has seen pictures like this of the horse and overloaded sled. I guarantee you, those horses did not. They didn't. These were photos taken later on. This was probably taken here in the Spirit National Forest. They were recruiting tools that were sent to Scandinavia to recruit Scandinavians to come here. And well, your puny little Scots pine, look at, why do you want to cut those? Come to North America, you can cut big pines like this. So these were recruiting groups, but nonetheless, they give you an idea of the nature of the pines that were in the forest at the time. And I put this up, we all know the story of Paul Bunyan and the logging and everything else. But I think what's really interesting here is the enormous amount of timber that was taken out of the range of white pine. In Maine, by the 1840, white pines were done, completely done. Maine had already switched to spruce as their prime timber species. 6 billion board feet were taken out of Maine and run down the Penobscot, Kennebec rivers to the sawmills in Bangor and elsewhere. Then there were some in the northern New York, some in Pennsylvania. When they got beyond the Alleghenies, all of a sudden, the white pine just seemed exhausted. And the reason for that is that we got into an area they got into an area geologically that was perfect for white pine. Instead of being a mountainous area, you have these big flat glacial landscapes with large amounts of outwash sand, bush plains, which is the perfect soil for growing up. And the loggers got out there. They said, we thought it was red in Maine. Look at this stuff. And the farther west we go, the better it gets. And they knew the prairie was out there. They knew there was a limit to white pine, but it didn't seem as if they could ever reach that limit, that they would ever cut the stuff. And so out of Michigan, lower Michigan, the center point is one big outwash point. Much of the UP is a big outwash point. And because of the size of it, most of the white pine actually came out of Michigan. 6 billion board feet out of Maine, 162 billion feet out of Michigan. Wisconsin, again, Central Sands and Chippewa Valley, 70 billion board feet came out of Chippewa. Wisconsin, 47 came out of the Chippewa Valley. And that's actually where Weyerhaeuser got its start. And Frederick Weyerhaeuser, the patriarch of the family, in a letter called the Chippewa Valley Loggers' Paradise, because there was so much white pine there, it was so easy to get and wrap down the Chippewa to the Wisconsin River, eventually to Mississippi, all the way down to St. Louis and New Orleans, where many of the older buildings are built out of white pine in Wisconsin. In Minnesota here, 36 billion board feet, somewhat less because white pine is only mainly in the arrowhead here. But out of Stillwater, 7 billion board feet just went through Stillwater, more than in all of the entire state of Maine, just through Stillwater. So next time you're in Stillwater, looking at the art shops and everything else, there were something like 24 sawmills at one time in Stillwater. Milling 7 billion feet. It was just amazing. It was an amazing amount of timber. You'll know what a board foot is. Fine. It's a board that's a square foot and 1 inch thick. So this many billions of board feet is an enormous amount of timber. It generated an enormous amount of wealth. White pine generated more wealth than all the gold in California. So we think of the gold rush as generating more wealth. White pine far generated that. White pine, by the end of the 1800s, was generating more wealth than all the food that was grown in the country. So in a lot of ways, white pine during this era, which, got rid of a lot of the white pine to create, but nonetheless, white pine built the culture built the frontier, literally the settlements. Detroit, Chicago, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, St. Paul, St. Louis, New Orleans, Memphis. The early building Starksville cities was with what it built the culture of the frontier, and it built the wealth of this country. But it also created this idea of commodity, that the woods were like a big, you could go out there and get whatever you want. And this is America, it's free, this belongs to all of us, it's free for the taking. It's got a very different view of how to think about things than Native Incidentally, that drawing there is a drawing of my grandfather's tomb. So Thoreau comes along in the 1840s and said, you know, I'm going to go up to Maine and I'm going to look for the remaining pines before they're all gone. He takes one canoe trip, the Kennebec River, Penobscot River, and he doesn't see any pines. He sees beautiful forests, he writes beautifully about it, but there's no white pine. He says, you know, something's missing. Thoreau had an intuitive idea, feeling that with the loss of the white pine, something changed. But he didn't think too much of it. He thought, well, maybe next trip I'll go further north. Next trip comes along and goes further north than me, doesn't see anyone, sees the remains of logging camps, doesn't see anyone. Third trip comes along and goes even further north, all the way up to Maine, no one. And now he's getting pissed off. What have we done to the forest? And he speaks to a logger, and the logger said, wow, now there was one little pine tree that was so big that my yoke of oxen stood on its stump. And now Thoreau gets really pissed, and he writes in his book, The Maine Woods, the pine tree might have stood on its own stump a great deal more comfortably than your yoke of oxen can if you had not cut it down. There's a higher law in our relations to pine as well as man. And the phrase, a higher law, was used at the same time by the abolitionists, that there's a higher law that says people cannot be slaves. And Thoreau was friends with a lot of those abolitionists in New England. So he took that phrase from the abolitionists and applied it to nature, that there's a higher law beyond economics and everything else that we should think about protecting nature. Thoreau did not write anything about wilderness until afterwards. And I think it was the shock of not seeing white pine in Maine, where he was hoping to see it, feeling that the loss of that white pine changed the forest somehow. That was one of the things that led to his ideas of wilderness and wilderness position. All that came out his trips in the Maine Woods. The Maine Woods is a wonderful, it's my favorite woods to read. I never finished Walton. I think Walden, frankly, I'm bored by it. He's cranky in Walden. But in the Maine Woods, it's beautiful descriptions of the Northwoods, and highly recommend. So Thoreau comes back home to Concord, to Walden, and he sees white pines coming up here and there in the fields. And he's saying, well, if we're going to restore white pines, we need to figure out what's going on here and how they're reestablishing themselves. And he starts watching what's going on and talking to people. And a couple of people he talked to said, you know, if we cut our white pines on property, the land comes back to oak. If we cut oak, the land comes back to white pine. He said, what's going on? We should come back to whatever's there. And he starts watching what's going on. And Thoreau makes the first connection between white pine and another species other than what the Native Americans had already been doing. And he sees that red squirrels in the fall gather up the green white pine cones like this one here. And they get on top of a stump or a rock, a little bit of high place where they can watch out for the foxes, and they start chewing the seeds, but they don't eat all the seeds. And sometimes they take the cone somewhere and burn it. So the red squirrels are dispersing white pine seeds more, often into the oak woods nearby. And what they don't eat, the seeds, the cones open at the top of the tree, and the seeds are dispersed into the oaks by the wind. At the same time, the squirrels are going into the oak forest and getting acorns, and they're bringing them into the pine forest to bury them. So, because in the pine forest, with all this canopy holding up the snow, they could get to the acorns under less snow. You've all had the experience of walking from a deciduous forest into a pine forest, and all of a sudden the snow is not as deep. So the squirrels are instrumental in moving seeds back and forth. Thoreau writes an essay about this called forest succession. And the idea of succession is a very important concept in American ecology of one species succeeding another after the sequences as the community develops. Thoreau was the one who introduced it through his observations. And you get all this out of Thoreau's journals, which are just wonderful. You want to read Thoreau's journals, don't get an abridged edition. Because the people who've made all these abridged editions are English speakers. And they kept all the bad poetry and bad philosophy and all this stuff. And they abridged by throwing out all the natural history. You can get the complete set of his journals. It's now been reprinted over and over again. Edited by one of the guys was Torrey. It's published by who's it published by? Anyway, you could get the complete set, and Princeton University Press is going to reissue it soon. But you have to get the complete journals, not the abridged edition, to see all this natural history. The other thing that other people began to notice that with the loss of white pine, we really changed the landscape. This is a painting by Sanford Gifford, who was a member of the Hudson River School. And if you know anything about the Hudson River School of painters, these were painters like Frederick Church and Albert Bierstadt. And they would paint these huge canvases, like now the size of those two closets put together, huge, of the American landscape, both in New England and the Adirondacks, but also out west. And they would put people in there. People would be very tiny, like the very tiny farmer. Right here. Okay. And the idea was to show the greatness of the American landscape and how small we were. So the tide was starting to turn, that nature is a lot bigger than us and it's beautiful. And maybe we are. This painting is unusual because what it shows is this is Hunter Mountain. The title of the painting is Hunter Mountain Twilight. This is Hunter Mountain, in fact. Hunter Mountain at that time, this was still all virgin oak forest. But what it shows to the front is a landscape that's been cut to make a farm. There's a farmhouse and barns and so forth. But you can see that the landscape is a wreck. It's a complete wreck. The stumps are left high, a lot of wasted timber there. The land is eroding. The stream is muddy. The cows are in there. They're eroding the banks. They're making it muddy. And Sanford Gifford was showing, by contrast, there's the original American landscape in the background. This is what we're doing now. It was this particular painting was really a force for conservation, and because of the loss of white pine and all those stumps. This, at the same time, also led George Perkins Marsh to write his great book, Man and Nature, in which he lays out the idea of a watershed, what loss of timber and forest will be doing to the American watersheds, degrading the quality of water, increasing floods, all the things. It's a beautiful book in which he really lays out the whole ideas of the science of watershed ecology is based on. But in addition, notice the last name, Gifford. Anybody here of Gifford can show?
Yeah.
Some people may have. The founder of the U.S. Forest Service, Sanford Gifford, was a friend of the Pinchot families. And Gifford Pinchot, Sanford Gifford was Gifford Pinchot's godfather. Gifford Pinchot was named after Sanford Gifford. And they own that painting. That painting resided above the fireplaces of all the Pinchot homes that Gifford Pinchot lived in. Well, Gifford Pinchot comes and starts a forest service, but he says we have to educate American foresters in American trees and American biology and American ways of management. And key idea, original idea of the forest is one of them, is to restore the white pine. And restoring the white pine, not for wilderness, like the road, but to provide a sustainable supply of timber. What was going on before that was simply mining forest for wood. It was not sustainable. So Pinchot brought the idea of sustainability into forestry, and this is really the start of forestry as an idea. And he wrote a little book called The White Pine. And this book is about this big, you could fit in your back pocket, and it contains a lot of stuff that the first foresters needed to restore white pine, including volume tables. So if you measure a white pine tree, the diameter and its height, there are tables in there that can tell you what the board fee, how much board feet is in there, and so forth and so on. It was a handbook for foresters to take with them in the field. It told the foresters what kind of soil to plant on, and so forth and so on. This was the first real book of American forestry. But shortly after that, a botanist named Bolney Spalding was at the University of Michigan, and Bernard Furno, a forester who was at Cornell, did a true scientific study of white pines and wrote a monograph. It's really wonderful. As a scientist, when I read people like Thoreau and stuff, I can sort of see their scientific ideas, but I don't sort of feel like they're quite yet. When I read this book, it's like I can walk down the hall and talk to this. This is real science at this point. And this book, for the first time, mapped the range of any tree species in North America. The range of white pine also showing places where it grew better or worse. It also provided a lot more tables of graphs of growth of white pine. This is the height of white pine at different ages and different kinds of soil types. Pinchot's book only got data from Pennsylvania. This had data from throughout the range of pine. To read it, it's kind of boring. If you're a scientist and psychologist, these graphs, it was just fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Talked about the anatomy of white pine needles, very botanical description of the needles in wood. Also the diseases of white pine and so forth, and the insects that depend on white pine, including the eastern pine, which we have here. It's the only butterfly that spends part of its life on white pine. And the males will go to the top in a few weeks of the white pine trees, the tallest white pine tree, send out their pheromones to attract the females. The females will lay their eggs in the very tip of the tree. And if you have wild strawberries, they come down and they nectar on the wild strawberries, which are blooming at the same time. So if you know of any places with white pine and wild strawberries, when the strawberries are blooming, go to that stand, and you stand a good chance of seeing these butterflies. They're brown and black and tan. They're not beautifully colored like monarchs, but they're very striking. You can't mistake them for anything else. And they're tiny, only have this, but they're very. So the time was, okay, so now we got to go out and plant white pine. Guess what? We have no white pine seedlings. All the seed trees have been cut. The fires came through, like the cloquet fire and the moose lake fire, burned up the forest floor, burned up all the seeds. What are we going to do? Well, the Germans had been taking seeds over to Germany and planting them in nurseries over there because the Germans liked the white pine so much that they wanted to start a white pine timber industry in Germany. So the German foresters were growing a lot of seedlings. So we thought, great, we'll just buy seedlings. These are American seedlings, after all, even though they're grown in Germany, but we'll buy them back from the Germans and start planting them. And unfortunately, one of the nurseries that we got most of those seedlings from had blisters. And that's how blisters got imported to the United States. And it took a long time to figure out exactly how this disease worked. And this is the first real example where the life cycle of the disease in relation to the life cycle of the host plants was worked out. And if you're a disease organism, you're killing a host, that's not a good way to live, because all your hosts are dead. And now you need another host that you're not going to kill to live on in the intervening time. And that other host is for blisters, is the gooseberries and all the species of genus, whites, currants, blackberries, gooseberries, and so forth. And figuring this out from about 1900 to 1920, eventually we figured out how blisterus works. And the idea was, well, you can't be planting white pine when there's gooseberries, we got the gooseberries.
The two other posts also species pollinated. It's all out there. That's
Those are also hosts, but in the Northeast,
that's
gooseberries.
what it's-
So the people who started planting white pine were CCCs. And some of my uncles, some of Mary's uncles were in CCCs. Anybody here have relatives who were in the CCCs? Okay. So this was started to actually as a social experiment to get young men from the cities out into the woods because they were unemployed in cities. Roosevelt was worried that this was going to lead to gangs and riots. He wanted to give young men a healthy life. And Pinchot was actually instrumental in starting the CCCs. And the two things the CCCs did was dig up the gooseberries all over as much as they can and plant trees of all species, including white pine. You see that the first CCC camp was named after President Roosevelt. And here's some white pines. The CCCs also taught many of these young men to read. And in the evenings, they had classes, largely in natural history and forestry and so forth, but they taught the young men to read. And many of these young men wrote back home really beautiful poetic letters. Remember, these were young men often they had never been out. And one of my favorite lines from one of these letters is, "We worked in a world alive with beauty, more lovely than I had." It's not wonderful. This is just a young man from the inner city who was probably illiterate before he went to the CCCs. So it was a great conservation movement. It was a great social experiment as well. The CCCs also built fire towers. Smokey the Bear started at this time. And it was natural for people to think, well, we can't have forest fires because many of the people at that time, my parents and grandparents, so forth, had lived through the big fires, the Moose Lake Fire, the Plum Fire in Michigan, okay, and so forth. Fire was thought to be a big danger, and we need to stop fire. This fire tower here, that's the one off of Highway 23. That was a CCC built fire. But with the creation of the boundary layers, there was there still is big controversy about what are we going to do in boundary layers because some of it had been lost. And there was a thought that we needed to work to restore some flogged over areas. And so this led to the Forest Service starting a large study of the ecology of the boundary layers. One of the main scientists on that was a good friend of mine. Some of you may, Dave, you may have met Bud Heinzman. Some of you probably know Bud Heinzman and Walton. And Bud Heinzman actually canoed through the boundary layers, trying to figure out what the history of the white pine stands were by looking at the canopies of the different stands from this canoe. And you can delineate different ages of stands by their canopies. And you would go in there from the lake. This is Saginaw Lake up here, the Seagull Lake. And would go in and it would pour these trees and take the core out, and you would see drop black rings. And those were times of fires in the past. Big white pines will survive fires for the most part because they have really thick working bark. So the fire will scorch the bark and wood, and they'll just keep growing around. So, and from that, he could figure out the fire history of these stands. And when he did this, it turns out that every stand in the boundary waters with white pine originated from the fire. And these were the dates of the first fires in these different stands, 1801, 1815, 1903, and way down here, this little stand here, an island in Seagull, called 3 Mile Island, were 3 pines that dated back to 1598. Those were the oldest ones in the boundary waters. They've since blown down in various windstorms, but I was fortunate to be on a field trip that boat took us to those white pines. It's about 2 years. So that was good. But this is the first time anybody has shown that fire, the cloquet fires and so forth, of course, in the logging section, were a danger to the forest and Smokey Bear, but that forest depended on fire for the origination. In fact, to maintain a white pine stand, actually, white pine needs fires in the understory every now and then to clear up the vegetation. But then, so this is the Greenwood Lake Farm, just a couple years ago. Mike Shortman, who everybody here I'm sure knows, this is a photograph he took around this county. But you can see there's some trees that survived the fire in the past. And 2 years ago, I was driving on Highway 2, and here's a large white pine that survived the fire. See, here's some blacker ones that didn't, and some aspen coming up here. But this is what Bud was talking about, that the large trees that survived the fire, the seed sources for the next generation. So that tree is going to, every 3 or 4 years, have a big crop of cones. It's going to be sending out a lot of seeds, and presumably, well, it's going to be interesting to keep going back and see what seeds are coming in. But this is how the forestry prepares itself. That brings us to the Riley family and a idea known as ecological silviculture of how do we use how species react to disturbances in the past to manage a forest today. Because when we go into a forest with a chainsaw, we're acting as a disturbance. So can we do this in such a way that we use what we learn about how trees react to past disturbances like windstorms and fire and so forth, better manage a forest? And this is what the Riley family is trying to do, starting with John's dad, Jack, and continuing today in the Wolf Lake Trail. And all of this looks like the boundary waters of all that has Spanish forest. If you walk through this forest, you'd swear you were in the boundary waters. Then you look around, well, there's a stump, and there's a stump, and there's a stump. These aren't old stumps. These are recently cut stumps. And, well, I didn't have another slide. Sorry about that. I was hoping I had another slide to show you what's like on there. But we're starting to use this, develop this idea called ecological silviculture. And one of the main impetuses for that is John's work and also working in conjunction that the Chippewa National Forest is doing. So northern Minnesota is one of the key areas for developing this new idea of ecological silviculture, more naturally managing plants. So this brings us finally to what's going to happen in the future. As I said, in sort of now, climate change was responsible for the development of diversity of plants. Pines have always done climate change. What's going to happen in the future? One of the key things about this period of climate change is we are warming faster than ever from the geological. Very, very fast. And one of the concerns is that the climate will migrate away from trees faster than the trees can get to the climate. Whereas at the glacier, the climate changed more slowly and the tree species can expand more or less. Expanding more. Now it's like pulling away from the trees. So what do? One is to plant trees from more southern areas into places like this now, that maybe when the climate gets warmer, they will be more adapted to the warmer climate. And the Nature Conservancy is working on that. It's called the system of migration. One of the other things the Conservancy is working on is something called conifer strongholds. And what they've done is, this is a map of different temperature zones of northern Minnesota. Red is warmer and blue is colder, near the Buckland area. And that these dots are places where they place plots, and they're planting these different trees, not just the white pine, but spruce and fir, spruce and red oak and fir. To see if there are isolated pockets in the landscape that remain cool, that could be a stronghold, particularly for the northern conifers, that when we get handle on climate change, maybe it'll start to cool down, maybe in 100 years. These pockets will serve as refuges like North Carolina was, that they could spread out in this future. So there's a lot of work being done there. How do we assist white pine and other species to remain in the landscape while we get climate change? And again, northern Minnesota is one of the lead areas. So, got a little longer than that. I could talk about white. I'm happy to take any questions if anybody has. I can stay and send.
Looking at the map that you have on one of them, it looks like in the lower Canadian province, the Atlantic to the Canadian prairies, white pine did not mimic what it did below the border. Am I wrong?
So is that map?
Yeah. That,
Well, white pine, it comes down the spine of the Appalachians. And as you get further and further south, you see it at higher and higher elevations. So the lower limit of white pine is higher and higher. It's just in cool areas. So this is why down here, the lighter green is less abundance and slower growth. It's because it's getting into an area that's really not good habitat for it. Here's the area of Pennsylvania where there was a pocket of large white pine. This is where Pinchot stayed in this one. The Spalding Inferno came from Duluth. But you can see the area greatest growth is this area from Maine to Michigan and Wisconsin. This is where all that, 100 and some billion board feet. So that's what that's showing is different amounts of growth. That's a really neat. It's the first range map of any species in North America. Any species.
the one thing you didn't mention was white-tailed deer, and here in northeastern Minnesota, it was moose caribou habitat originally when the
Yeah.
first dominated. But when I look at that, much of that area must have been white-tailed deer. Do you have any sense of what the relationship was, and why there seemed to be such a problem here, but maybe you weren't there?
Well, white-tailed deer problem here. When I first moved here, I saw more moose up here than I saw deer. And even in the early 1980s, Dave Meach saw caribou in northern Minnesota. The reason why we have a lot of deer is because in the 1980s, the DNR and other agencies and the potlatch and so forth, the mills start to switch to aspen instead of pine for making paper. And they started clear cutting huge areas, and it became nothing but aspen. And the deer moved in at that time. And deer carried the brain, and that caused the caribou went extinct in the 1950s, except for this odd little herd that came down from Ontario that they saw. The last caribou herd was around this valley. And it was shot in one winter by food from a logging camp in this valley. So it was in the 1980s, the deer were here, but they were really expanded because of the clear cutting. And moose don't really like to go on the big. They like to stay around the edges, but deer will go anywhere. And that clear cutting and regeneration aspen, which deer love, allowed the deer to move in here, bring the rainworm, moose populations crashed. Reintroducing caribou here is, forget it. It's not gonna happen. Caribou will die within 3 months. And that's why we had a lot of deer. So we need to get back to long rotation forestry to get the deer population down. And we need to shoot does. We need to shoot the does. And to get the deer population down, to allow the moose population to come back. But also to allow the white pine to regenerate, because the deer eat the white pine as well. Moose don't, deer do.
But in what I was thinking about this in the eastern part of the White Pine Range, that must have been predominantly white-tailed deer originally, or was it always moose,
Here?
caribou everywhere there?
And here,
Yeah,
that was caribou and moose. When that map was made, in the late 1800s, that was, or just before that, it was caribou and moose when we were.
You mentioned one species that is the canopy. Has there been any canopy research? On just what's up there, even
And white pine,
in like,
there's been a little bit. Oh, the question was, has there been any research high in the canopy on the ecology of what's going on there? There's a little bit. There was an undergraduate student at Northern a number of years ago who was a rock climber, who used rock climbing ropes and techniques to get up in the canopies of white pine. And she found some, not spring peepers, but I forget what the frog was, something related to spring peepers high up in the canopy. So not a new species we knew about, but we didn't know it was way up there. But there hasn't been much done. So that would be a great area of research, just what's going on with it. The big area of diversity of high up in the canopy is in the tropics. And kind of doubt that we would see the richness of anything up in white pines that you see in the tropics. But nonetheless, I'm sure there's stuff going on. So anybody wants to do a graduate research?
So I remember you being in Tom Otter's store, where the white pine that took the western up, and the one that took the northern.
Yeah.
Do you like those around, did that come from Dixon's work?
Davis, Margaret Davis. Yeah, she was the one who actually showed that.
Yeah.
These two lines came together. When they came together, they were a little bit different. There was some cross pollination going on there that may have resulted in distinctly Minnesota population and cross pollinations. White pine needles are shorter than the needles of white pine in North Carolina. There's a number of that indicate that there was some evolution happening as the white pine spread northwest.
Yeah, I read your book. It's absolutely fascinating. I loved it. But as a writer, and sometimes as musicians, some of the work ends up on the floor. Was there a story that didn't make it into your books? Did you have a favorite that you that made it?
I'll tell you one, because I got a little flack from a friend of mine in Canada. So Jerry, you're just talking about the United States. We have white pine in Canada too. And I said, my favorite, so that's in first place. The title is an American Foundational Speaker. And I had a limited number of pages and words from the publisher and everything else. My favorite story was that there was a war in the border of Maine and Canada between Canadian loggers and American loggers, where the border between Maine and Canada was going to be. And the idea was where eventually settled was on the St. John's River. But the Canadian loggers wanted the border to be on this side of the St. John's River. The American loggers wanted to be on the other side. And there was a war. Nobody got killed, but there was an actual war between the loggers that lasted for a few weeks. And then the governments got together and said, okay, we got to settle this. And it became the St. John's River. So Americans stay on this side of the St. John's River. Canadians stay on this side. I think it was called the Worcester. It's in Worcester County.
So maybe one more question, and I think John's willing to stay and sign books or answer questions afterwards. One more?
Well, John, this is, you mentioned Bud, committed it up. It's by far, they did, it was lonely. What he was trying to teach us was not inside the forestry. His career, and the only reason I bring it up is, I think of our country today, and imagine it might be even more difficult to be different. Have any reflections on the bravery it takes to be a science researcher that might run amok cultural values?
Yeah, I can tell you lots of stories from personal experience. It's not good. It's not good. You know, most of us, we don't want to get involved. I hate it. I hate it. I'm glad other people like it. And, you know, I side with one party more than the other. You can probably figure out which one it is. But I just, because it's not, when scientists look at something in nature and they say, gee, here's a pattern in nature, I think maybe it's caused by this. We also have to say, what if we're wrong? What if we're wrong? What else could cause it? And we have to test that too. And this is actually, people think science doesn't have any moral. That's the moral underpinnings. What if we're have to admit that? And if you don't admit that in your papers are not going to be accepted. It's just part of how science is done. No, none will admit that. And so that's why it's very difficult. That's why it's very difficult to work in political environment. Because what they usually want you to do, and this is by my experience, people from both parties, they want you to come up with the data and the scientific support for what they want to have already. And science just doesn't work. And when you don't do that, they get angry. And they create a lot. And they create a lot. Both Democrats. And what they do, here's their strategy. Here's their strategy. They don't come to me or any other scientists and say, John, you jerk, you're all wrong, you're making problems for everybody, you're wrong. They did that. Say, have a seat, and I give you a cup of coffee, do you like a donut? You want sprinkles on that? Let's talk. Because maybe I am wrong. They go to your boss. They go to your dean. They go to your chancellor. They go to your university president. And they say, You guys want more money for more faculty? You know that chaired position that we were promising you? We got problem with it. We understand academic freedom, but aren't there other problems? That's what it's.
Well, I probably should have asked. In part, I did because I
But
wanted to bring up how much I admire you.
well, not unusual, every one of us is facing this. But, faced a lot of it. Here's another story, when I got in trouble over one thing, climate change, what I was living with. Evelyn in the city is another paleontologist, and her bright, a geologist, and Bud Heinzman called me. And they said, John, we hear you. And I said, yeah, I am. And I said, I don't know what to do. And they all said, don't worry. We understand what's going on. We're keeping an eye on it. If anything happens, we're going to talk to the principal of the university. Don't worry. So those guys did a lot to help me through the difficult period because they went through the same thing. Evo with the Madagascar fiasco, Bud with the and also with the Madagascar. So this happens generation to generation, but it seems to be getting.
One more white pine question. Anybody have any?
Before living here, Sandy and his employees, we had a huge. And had a. The mayor never mentioned them yet tonight.
No, that's another one.
Oh, he was good at vinegar, and you know, and some of them got. The vinegar, which, yeah, you have to do.
Do you want to say that?
Yeah, I mean, what is about afterwards? He was. We were on.
But white pines and park pines have worked together.
And they said, when you shoot that one, you remember the next one, because there'll be someone else over there. They said, put a band on the tree.
Yeah, the problem there is that when there were lots of white pines, you know, porcupines can take over the lot. White pines aren't.
Okay.
Now, when we have so few big white pines, we want to save those trees. So we want to protect them from porcupines. But naturally, that's what a porcupine would have done for that pine. But it was.
Thank you so much.